Hello and welcome everyone. I'm Susan Sprung, National Executive Director of the Producers Guild. It's an exciting week for the PGA as we continue to celebrate all of our nominees for the 2022 Producers Guild Awards. Tonight, I'm thrilled to introduce a panel featuring the 8 films that have been nominated for Outstanding Producer of Documentary Motion Picture. I'd like to welcome PGA member and moderator of tonight's roundtable, Diane Becker. Diane is an award-winning producer with Fishbowl Films. Her most recent credits include Tina, Whirlybird, On the Divide, and the 2022 Sundance Festival favorite, Navalny. Thank you, Diane. Take it away.
Thanks so much, Susan. I really appreciate it. And I just want to say hi and welcome everybody and congratulate all these wonderful producers and director producers here today. I think the PGA prides itself on, always picking a diverse and wonderful group of films to celebrate every year. And this year is no exception. And I think, what's extraordinary about it is that we also just have some films in the mix here that are really just bringing us to a moment in time and in history with, the theme for every film being, just the triumph of humanity and inspiration. So I just want to congratulate everybody here. I want to start off by introducing everybody. We've got the director producer of Ascension, Jessica Kingdon. We've got the producer of The First Wave, Jenna Millman. We've got the producer director of In the Same Breath, Nanfu Wang. We have the director producer of Simple as Water, Mylan. We've got the director producer of Riding with Fire, Sushmit Ghosh. And we have the producer of Summer of Soul, Joseph Patel, and the producer of Flea, Monica Hellstrom. And last but not least, the producer of The Rescue, John Batzik. Hi, everybody.
Hello.
Thanks for taking time today. Let's just start at the alphabetical order at the top with Jessica and Ascension. Could you just kind of, talk to us about the inspiration for the film and, how you, came about sort of getting yourself into all of these wonderful, incredible spaces and how you decided to sort of structure the film and tell the story?
Yeah. That's always the downside of the A titles. We have to go first. So Ascension is an exploration of the Chinese dream today. And I got interested in making films in China when I made a short film a few years ago that takes place in Yiwu, which has the largest wholesale mall in the world. And I was interested in this space for this paradox of my connection to it as a consumer. This mall holds most of the so-called cheap made in China goods, but also my disconnection to it since on the other side of the supply chain as a consumer, we don't see where, these products come from and understand the humanity behind the spaces. And also exploring heritage as being half Chinese. And so from there, I grew interested in trying to connect the dots of these hidden economies that power day-to-day consumer lifestyles. So in that sense, that's why Ascension, it is bookended by these 2 locations that have to do with the base of the supply chain of technology. So the film opens in a low-wage labor market where people are looking for jobs at places like Huawei and Foxconn, famously making iPhones, and then closes in a rare earths mineral mine. And the rare earths are what are used to make smartphones. And I was kind of looking at the hidden consequences of all of this in terms of capitalism. So income inequality, alienation, pollution, but also simultaneously trying to understand how it has also lifted hundreds of millions of people out of poverty and created a new middle class in China. And I think I was interested in China for this question because of its very compressed timeline in terms of its economic ascent in just a few decades. And so I was drawn to China for these questions where larger questions related to the paradox of economic progress are magnified. So those were kind of the guiding principles that brought me to all of the different locations you see in the film.
And what were some of the challenges? I mean, did you find yourself was it easy as a, producer director to kind of get into these spaces, or, where were the sort of production kind of challenges for that?
Yeah, I worked with a great team of field producers within China. And so they acted as a liaison between myself and the different places we were trying to access. And since the directorial vision of the film, I didn't have like a thesis that I was trying to go in to prove. If, locations told us no and didn't want us to come in, which happened more times than not, I was able to pivot and, look for places that were allowing us to come in. So I think having this flexibility, allowed us to, if a location backed out at the last minute, for example, it didn't shut the production down. We were just able to pivot and be kind of flexible in terms of the places that did let us in. And since we weren't filming in any like necessarily sensitive areas, we were, totally transparent about being this American independent film crew making a observational film about China's economic rise. And yeah, I would say, the field producers I worked with, it was like an extremely resilient team. So people would have to ask until we got one yes. Sometimes it would take dozens or even hundreds of requests of different locations until we got, a single green light.
Right. And, in terms of, as you were creating the film, when did you realize that you had the sort of structure and kind of figured out like how you wanted to sort of outlay it, and did that sort of change your approach to, how you were filming and what you were choosing?
Yeah, initially the film was meant to be slightly more environmentally driven. I was interested more in this life cycle of consumer products, looking at the cycle of production, consumption, and waste. But as I was trying to get access to certain locations, I realized that wasn't as relevant. Like, for example, I wanted to film in so-called e-waste villages, which we think of, plastic at the end of the life cycle. It's not like it just disappears. And similarly with electronics, they don't just disappear, it goes somewhere. It's not like it, is as recyclable as we think. So there are these villages that were popping up that were dedicated to kind of breaking the materials down. And there was a lot of environmental harm that it was causing to the people. But this has actually moved to Southeast Asia and countries in Africa. And as I realized that my research, that wasn't as relevant to what I thought, it kind of shifted to become more about this pursuit of upward mobility and this study of materialism that is, reflected in China and the rest of the world, and particularly the Western world. So the kinds of, places that I was looking after evolved throughout the shoot. And I split it up into 4 shoots. And after each shoot, I was able to look at the types of footage I was getting and kind of pivot the approach in terms of what sorts of locations we were looking after. And it was this kind of tightrope balance between places that had visuals that could speak for themselves, and also places where there was more dialogue and more of the kind of exposition scenes where you see people in these training schools and there's more kind of verbal content happening. So I kept kind of going back and forth between prioritizing each of those spaces until, at the end, I felt like I finally had enough.
Right. And how long was it from when you started filming until you were finished and sort of releasing the film in the, into the world last year?
It was around 2 or 3 years. The whole thing start to finish was about 3.5 years, but we started filming April 2017. And then the last 4th and final shoot was December 2019. So my timing was very, lucky with the pandemic, since it was right before everything got shut down in China. And I remember my co-producer, Maggie Lee, after I came back to New York from that final shoot, she was stuck in her hometown for weeks and weeks. And this was right after the last shoot. And then editing, I had been editing throughout as well. But, I was able to really fully focus on editing for maybe 5 months after that.
Wow, that's great. Thanks so much for sharing. So, I mean, I think I want to pivot to Nanfu and, you know, sort of in the same breath, you know, sort of at the beginning of the pandemic, you know, can you talk to us about, I mean, I remember seeing you at Sundance in 2020. Can you talk about just the process of starting the film and you know, and then just kind of some of the challenges that you faced sort of trying to do this remotely? And
yeah, sure. So I started making this film accidentally, and as Jessica was talking about, you know, the pandemic started in China in January. I was in China in January 2020 to visit my family, and little did I know that the outbreak was going to happen. So I left my 2-year-old son in China, and I came to Sundance, and that was the day the Wuhan went into full lockdown and the country was closing the borders very soon. So at the very beginning was mostly personal, that I needed to get my son out. I needed to make sure my mother and everyone in my family was safe. And as I was dealing with that personal crisis, I tried to gather information to understand how severe the outbreak was, and to understand what the government, to get any information that I could from the government, from people in Wuhan, from any sources I could find. And during that process, I realized there was a huge discrepancy between what the government was saying and what was actually happening. So I think right away after my son came back, I decided to make this film to expose the corruption, the censorship, the propaganda existed in China. And I quickly had a conversation with all my producing partners who I made One Child Nation together, you know, Julie Goldman, Chris Clemens, Callan Hepburn, and Jialin Zhang. So the 5 of us decided to act very quickly. We called HBO like very early in February. Nobody knew that the outbreak was going to reach the outside of China. So, but HBO was supportive and immediately decided they wanted to support this project. So we started filming, and one of the first challenges is how to get access. Wuhan was under full lockdown, and this is one of the strictest in the whole world. And to get people inside the hospital is even more difficult, and let alone like because of the previous films I made being politically sensitive. So I had to try to, you know, hide my name and talk to cinematographers and, you know, really gain both ways of trust, for them to trust me and for me to trust them, to know that this person is not going to report to the government on this project. And that took a while. I think we started getting one person who was able to go film for us, and then that person helped to connect to another person. And eventually we hired more than a dozen cinematographers filming inside Wuhan. And they were filming in the hospital, at the emergency centers, in people's homes. And by March, the outbreak reached the US, and I was in New York. I live in New Jersey and commute to New York. And I was very, very shocked by what I've witnessed. I think Jenna, like who produced the first wave, we probably could talk a lot about this, but the most shocking moment to me was realizing that it could have happened to a democratic country. And I started seeing a lot of the same mistakes being repeated here. So we started filming in the US as well. And all the producers, and we worked with cinematographers across the US in many different states. And the team ended up being more than a dozen cinematographers in the US as well. So this was the biggest shooting and producing crew of field producers and researchers that I have worked with. I was like over 20 cinematographers filming every day. And we filmed from January till the last shoot was January 1st of 2021. So we were filming that entire year, and we were editing simultaneously during that year too. So we actually picture locked in December 2020. And then when January 1st, 2021 happened in Wuhan, there was a very symbolic moment where January 1st of 2020 there was a huge super spread event in Wuhan. And in 2021, they were doing exactly the same thing. So we actually like opened up the lock to cut and included that moment to be the one of the like the last scenes that people would see in the film. Yeah.
Wow. Yeah. I remember, I mean, just watching, when I saw the film and you see the balloons launch on that New Year's, at the beginning, and you're watching it at home, right? We're all watching it at home at that point and realizing what's about to come. It's sort of almost like a horror film unfolding. And I just felt, it was just such a claustrophobic, incredible, moment to sort of see all that. How did you, you're working with 24 cinematographers. Are you like on a Zoom call with everybody? How did that unfold, or how did you sort of, manage and lead all of these teams to kind of get you what you needed in order to continue the edit?
Yeah, it was really interesting because they were all filming remotely, and there is a different time zone, 12 hours difference. So during the day, I'm working with the US team. At night, I'm working with the China team. So that whole year, I felt like I was getting 5 hours sleep every night to like work double time with double team. And luckily, I think like we were able to build a platform that they can all upload footage right after they filmed. So within 3 hours, I would be able to see like the footage. And then we talk before they go out to film. I give them visual references and written documents and have a phone call, giving very detailed instruction and have conversations about what scenes need to be filmed and how it should be filmed. And then right away, I think the turnaround time was almost feeling like more efficient than if I would have been like filming on the ground on my other projects, because I was able to review it within 12 hours of the shoot. And then immediately the next day I would give a call. And sometimes it's a conversation. Sometimes I actually bring the footage because I was editing at the same time. I would bring in the footage in the program Premiere and choose segments, either to give notes, write caption on it, like don't move at this moment, or slow down in this second, or stay on this. So the instruction then I would send back to them as a video. So I think is very clear that what they needed to be to do it differently. Sometimes a crop a shot and say film tighter or film lower, wider in a way. So it worked out really well in that sense. And we were able to also, this is one liberating moment that I realized, because each of these 20 cinematographers has their own style and has their own personality. And after a shoot or two, I started noticing how their lens, their views reflected their worldview and reflected their political views. And you can tell by how they frame their shots, what is their focus when they are in the moment. And after that, I found it very, very fascinating and liberating to assign that person to film things that would maximize and highlight that political point of view. In some events, I would send 3 people to film the same thing, but each from a different point of view. And because the themes of the film is government official narrative and citizens narrative, and how the propaganda works and how the government is shaping the narratives. So sometimes when I have 3 different angles of seeing the same thing from different point of view, it works to support the narrative.
I mean, just listening to that, it's such a producing feat, just like all that it took during that time. Thanks for sharing.
It is a luxury to be working with so many of them.
This is a good segue into, I think we should go to Jenna and the first wave next, just to sort of, contrast both of these, amazing films that are telling, really important historical stories about COVID, in different ways, but there's so much similarity in terms of the themes and everything. Jenna, can you talk about, how you came to this project and Matt's process and how you guys got access as well? Because again, access in the US is probably just as difficult as it is in China in some ways, just, with laws and everything else.
I was working with Matt on 2 other projects. We were sort of finishing or in different stages when we started getting word of what was going on in Wuhan. And I remember we were actually in a screening and, headlines were coming up and we thought, okay, we're going to have to do something, but what? And Matt said, I'm going to China. And we're like, okay, okay, you do that. For the moment, we had no idea. But we started to think about like, what would we do if this started to come towards us, which it obviously was going to. And then as soon as it touched ground on our shores, we started putting out feelers sort of madly and wildly to every hospital we could think of, because we didn't know how big this was going to be, but we knew we wanted to be on, and I hate all of the war comparisons, but this is what it was, on the front lines of this thing with the people who were actually having to face the unknown every single day. And that process, was sort of a 24-hour-a-day outreach process. And yeah, this is not an easy time to fill in the hospitals for all the correct reasons, but also sort of difficult reasons, because we're a very litigious society. But ultimately we knew that this was of the utmost importance. So we had to be there and we had to be able to tell the story from the perspective of the people who are actually living it, not from the people who are standing outside the hospitals and giving sound bites. And we, luckily through a partnership or a friendship of Matt's from a prior film, we were introduced to Long Island Jewish Hospital, part of the Northwell Hospital Group, and they opened their doors. And they had actually just finished another series, so they had some awareness of what it was like to film with the crew. And they really did, credit to them, they really did open up their doors to us and, sort of allowed us to start meeting doctors and nurses that were on the front lines. And just back to what Nanfu was saying, this is so big. I mean, this was the biggest story that any of us have really lived globally, I think, together. How do you cover something so big? And so I think this is very stylistically, Matt Heineman's style as well, as go small, be very intimate, both in the way that shots are framed, but also in this way that the story is told. We didn't want to get sort of carried away by the news that was going this way or that way, but rather actually be in the day-to-day of living it, which sometimes were very fast-moving scenes and sometimes very slow, a lot of waiting games. But the key to all of that was past the access point, getting actual access, right? We all know that you get in a door and that's one thing, but getting someone to open up their life and their heart to you is an entirely different thing. And in order to do that, it just takes time and really being on the ground and, getting people to trust you on a deeper level than I think most people understand. Because then you can be there with them when things happen. And we had no idea what was going to happen with any of our characters. We had no idea who was going to go through, who was going to recover, who wasn't going to recover in terms of patients, and what our healthcare providers, I think even more importantly, we had no idea what trauma and stress they were going to undergo. And so that was unfolding truly in front of our lenses.
Yeah. And I mean, that's what's so difficult, right? Is that it takes time to build trust. It takes time to get access. And the one thing you didn't have in that whole, during all that time was actually time, right? So it's just, how do you, pivot and make choices? And, can you talk a little bit about casting? Isn't, it's a word, but it's, it's obviously something that we don't really talk about, but it means everything in films like this.
We had, we obviously started with a wider net, but we actually got very lucky in that early on, we ended up meeting Dr. Natalie Duget, who is at the sort of center of the film. I think it was one of the first full nights that Matt spent in the hospital, was one of the nights that Dr. Duget was one of her first nights on one of the COVID units. And so that was kind of a no-brainer. She's unbelievable. And we didn't know what her story was going to be, but we knew that she was going to, you know, she was going to let us into her journey on some level. And then we pretty quickly, within the first, I guess, week or so, again, these weeks all sort of blur together because there was no night and day. There was sort of a 24-hour, we had shifts of DPs going into the hospital because we wanted to have a very small footprint at any one time. So we had teams of 2, 3 tops going in, and Matt, I don't think slept during that month at all. And we were doing sort of air traffic control from outside the hospital as well. And mind you, just side note, we also didn't know what was going to happen to our crew at that time too. So we were also trying to make up safety protocols as we went along, which was a little anxiety provoking back when we didn't know what this was at all. But we came across the Ellis family. We spoke to Alexis Ellis, who is the wife of one of the patients we followed. And we were introduced to her because she had made such a deep connection with one of the nurses we were following. And the nurse said, "You have to speak to this woman. She's just strength. She's strength on the other end of this FaceTime." So we called her, and she really wanted to participate. And I found out later, she told me there was sort of a no-brainer because her husband was a Black man in a hospital, and she wanted to make sure all the cameras were on him, which was a really striking thing. But it wasn't sort of a battle to get them to participate. She really wanted to make sure that their attention was being paid. And they really took incredible care of him. They would have, I think, anyway, because Ahmed Ellis just sort of seemed to carry away the hearts of all the healthcare workers. But, and then all the other characters kind of fell into place pretty quickly. And then we were following that main core of people for, from March until the end of summer, I guess. So a long time. And then
did you start the edit then, or were you trying to kind of get the edit moving along, or at least looking at the footage and understanding, like, how are you going to structure the story? You're following it, and where does it end? When there is no end.
Where it ends, I don't think it's ended. I mean, the film's ended, but this is the hardest thing when you're connected to an ongoing story that's so not in the past. But we started our edit pretty soon after we started filming, and we were trying to go through footage just as Nanfu was as we were filming, and because also when you are in the throes of a hospital, you don't actually always know what you have, and you can't see every angle and every frame and facial expression that might lead you. So we were trying to watch as fast as we could so we could give feedback to the field teams, and then also sort of direct where we would go next and where we would want to set ourselves up. And then the next part was trying to weave these stories together that all had overlap, and but what did they mean together? And I think very early on we wanted to make sure we weren't telling the story of COVID, that we were telling a story that would be more timeless and that was ultimately about something. But in the moment, it's hard to figure out what that something is. And then it quickly became clear, at least I think everyone takes away something different. But for me, in this moment of isolation and separation, and the shooting really revealed this stunning shooting of our cinematographers and of Matt, that the closeness and the connection is what ultimately brought people through. That it was the one nurse who helped the one wife on the one FaceTime call, and then that wife's strength was able to help that nurse get through her next day, and then she was able to help. I mean, every single person touched the other, and it was these little teeny moments of connection that allowed them to keep going. And that to me was really stunning when we were all sitting here in different places, completely separated and afraid.
Yeah, I mean, both your film and Nanfu's film are historical documents that I think we're all going to be watching, or looking back on for the remainder of our lives here. So thank you.
I just have to say our editors, Francisco Bello and David Zief and Gabe Rhodes, and all of our AE teams had, it was thousands of hours of footage, and it's a remarkable feat with all the help you can get to be able to, actually edit is a complicated thing in a remote and under the best circumstances. So they're my heroes.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you. Let's go to John Batzik and the rescue. John, can you tell us how you came to this incredible story of human resilience?
Yeah, very specifically, I just finished making a film called Citizen K, which Alex Gibney had directed, and I produced with a young producer called PJ Van Sandwich, who had in that instance secured the access to Mikhail Khodorkovsky. Miraculously, I have no idea how he did it, but he did. And he contacted me and said, what do you think about, he said, I think I might be able to get the rights to the British divers in the Thai cave story that had just unfolded. And he said to me, you know, do you think this is a film that we could get off the ground? And is it a story that interests you? And pretty rapidly, I said yes to both of those things. So it really was, in the first instance, as simple as PJ calling me and saying, I think we might be able to get these guys. Shall we have a go at it? And even at that point, I didn't know more than what we all knew fairly superficially from news reports, but I immediately, as one might, had an instinct that this must be an incredible story, and let's meet the divers, talk to them, and see if indeed we could secure their rights.
And so what you have their rights, you've got it. How did you come to Chai and Jimmy and then the process of actually like putting this together?
Well, PJ and I, once we'd secured the rights to the divers, and yeah, we fairly rapidly went to the marketplace with the story as it was, with the access that we had, and actually initially we had a different director who embarked on the project with us. So Chai and Jimmy, we connected with. We were probably, you know, we were some months down the road where we got to a point where the original director, basically we had sort of creative differences and felt like he didn't want to continue with it. At that point, we were financed by National Geographic, who PJ and I, when we'd gone to the marketplace, the people we eventually partnered with was National Geographic. And we were looking at all sorts of directors. Chai and Jimmy were pretty fresh off Free Solo. So obviously we knew them, and I was a huge admirer of that film, but somehow I don't know why, but didn't think necessarily that they would have the appetite, but Nat Geo suggested them. And we got on the phone with Chai particularly, but with both of them fairly rapidly. And it was clear that they had a huge passion for it. And so effectively they jumped straight on board, and we kept going, and we, you know, and off we went, because we had a lot more still to do. And we had the full backing of Nat Geo, who of course had 3 years or 2 years experience of working with them, which we didn't have. And yeah, we still had, you know, a vast amount of work to do, and they had a huge appetite for it.
And can you talk a little bit about, you know, just working with the divers and then getting into the cave, and sort of how all of that came along? Because I think, you know, those moments, they're so intimate in the film, and it's also probably cathartic for them as well.
Yeah, listen, it's, you know, they working with the divers was, I only hesitate because to use the word extraordinary, they are extraordinary, but they're extraordinary for their normalness. You know, I don't want to put them on a pedestal in a way, because that sort of separates them from their normality. And one of the beauty of these guys is they are incredibly normal, you know, and yet behaved extraordinarily in terms of what they did. So when we started to talk about the sort of nitty gritty of what we wanted from them, they were like horrified. I mean, the whole idea of it horrified them. They didn't much want to sit for interviews. They sure as hell didn't want to be part of reenactments, but only because the word act literally, you know, is like their nightmare. The idea that no matter how we define that word, they couldn't see past the fact that the directors were going to be asking them to act. And one thing they were very clear about is that they absolutely couldn't act. And you know, they were curmudgeonly to start with, for sure. And yet, you know, you're absolutely right. I think they didn't even know that. In fact, I know they didn't know the level to which actually going through this process with us was something they needed to do, because one of the things it's enabled them to do, which is just so wonderful, it's enabled them to see how incredible what they did was. You know, I think they are so, first of all, so in it, so not used to looking at themselves that way, so not used to praising themselves for doing anything at all, that actually going through the process of reenacting, which is what they did do, this whole experience, and actually the whole process of making the film and then their own reactions to their film and then to the film and then seeing other people's reactions to the film has really brought home to them not just how remarkable what they did was, but in some cases it's validated their lives in a way, which they've said themselves, which is really, really kind of, I think, one of the beauties of making documentaries, because I think we've probably all been in those positions before when you tell certain people's stories and completely organically and surprisingly, they discover that they get something so profound from the experience that helps them move on in life. You know, we had it with the Tillman story, we had it with Sergio, you know, really extraordinary stories where people are released from pain in many respects from the process of what they were doing. So what we did was, and for me as a producer, you know, for all the experience I may or may not have, you know, we shot 2 weeks in the Basildon water tank and the Pinewood water tank. We built these sets that looked to me like, there's no way that's going to work. That's not going to look right. You know, it looks like a sort of flabby bit of cardboard, but we built these amazing sets with brilliant set builders, I might add. And, you know, we embarked on a really complicated 2-week shoot with an absolutely brilliant underwater cinematographer, Ian Seabrook, and Chine Jimmy, who were extraordinarily focused, extraordinarily determined, you know, had a very, very strong and clear sense of what they thought they wanted. Had built up a very strong relationship with the divers, although quite attritional, because as I said, the divers were they weren't thrilled at the prospect. And you know, we shot for 2 weeks and it was right in the, well, it wasn't in the heart of COVID, but it was it was in COVID times, and therefore it was super complex in terms of testing and what you could do and what you can't do and who could be there and who couldn't be there. And by the way, you can only shoot under the water for X amount of time anyway, from a safety point of view. A DP is only allowed to shoot for, and I can't remember how many minutes it is or was. And then, you know, one of the things about working with Chine Jimmy, is that, you know, they want what they want and they want more of it by the day. So we were having to move and shift very quickly day by day as they decided, as we were shooting things, there was other stuff they wanted to do, different moments they wanted to shoot, reshoot, use the divers for things that they hadn't originally intended. And then also, you know, we shot with kids, you know, tying their hands under the water. It was powerful, it was emotional, and I think actually that part of it for the divers was really, really difficult, and certainly took them back to the original rescue itself. And yeah, it was 2 weeks, and I was glad when it was over.
I was going to ask you what the hardest part was, but you just unpacked all of that. I mean, unless there.
Yeah, the other incredibly difficult thing for the production was once we'd identified that there was a lot of footage that the Thai Navy SEALs had shot themselves, was the process of getting them to release it to us, which was agonizing, took forever. And if it wasn't for Chai's indomitable spirit and as I said, utter determination and brilliance, we wouldn't have got it. And you know, and so that really didn't transform the film, but it certainly enabled us to take the film to a different place, which I think means that it struck an even stronger chord, because one of the things that footage did was really show how people from all over the world came together to work in that cave, not just the divers rescuing the boys, but everything that needed to go into putting them in the position where they might be able to rescue those boys. And a lot of that was captured in that footage.
Yeah, I mean, it's you just see what happens when people come together, you know, for a common goal and to just help each other and what we're all capable. I think, you know, all of these films have that quality to them. So, so thanks for sharing. Let's go to Monica Hellstrom with Flea. Monica, can you talk about how you came to this project and the process that you all went through to get it from a series of interviews to a beautifully animated, heartwarming story?
Yeah, thank you. I actually met Jonas, I think around 17 years ago. I was at a something called the talent workshop, and he had a film there that we supported. So I've known Jonas for a long time, and he came to me in 13, and he'd been at this workshop for it's called Anidocs, and it's organized for animation people to meet documentary people, because I think animation, they wanted to tell sort of more different stories. They were looking for stories, and documentaries, sometimes it's hard to tell things that's happened in the past. So documentary people, we can use animation in terms of telling the past. So he came with this little clip he'd made, which is very much like the film today, about his friend Amin that came to Denmark when he was 16, and he'd never told Jonas the story about where he came from. He knew he came from Afghanistan. He didn't know how he got here to Denmark, and he didn't really know anything. So this story was like, within the friendship, it kind of made a sort of unspoken thing that they never really sort of addressed, and that Jonas were very curious about. So Jonas came with this method of perhaps telling his friend's story, and I mean, they talked about doing this, sharing the story for many years. Jonas comes from documentary, radio documentary, so he's used to sort of telling stories. He'd asked him previously, and he said no, but with using animation and making him anonymous, he agreed to do it, and was really ready. And I think, like what John was saying, I think for Amin, it was also a part of like sharing something traumatic, and by sharing it, also being able to move on. So I think that's the beauty of documentary films, that you create this space for your your protagonists to share, and to being able to move on by sharing your story.
Yeah. Can you talk a little bit about the animation and how you all approached it, and sort of the process of producing that,
Yeah. So we got introduced to, so Jonas came to us, and we're a documentary, and I'm producing it also with my colleague Signe Bøe Sørensen at Fine Cut for Real. And we got introduced to a company in Denmark called Sun Creature, and Charlotte de la Gunnerese, that's the animation producer. And it'd been really tough, because we knew it was going to be an animated documentary film, and we're trying to get finance to it, and we got a lot of no's, like people really didn't understand what it was, and we normally finance through like broadcasters and the Danish Film Institute, and it was really tough sort of making people understand. But when we met the Sun Creature and got introduced, it felt like they really understood what it was we were trying to do and wanted to tell. And somehow it became like a very passion project, because it was like we came from two different worlds, and trying to understand the language of each other. It took some time, because like with documentary, we making the story as we edit, we shoot and then we edit, and then sometimes go back and shoot. But with animation, you lock the story and then you start editing. So and then your story is very locked, you don't change it. So it took some time, and it's been a long process. I think that the project also needed that maturity of taking time and learning the language. And we did some tests, and we did a trailer. And as a producer, I really learned, because we saw all the sketches for the for the teaser, like the character designs, and it looked good, but it looked a little bit cartoony in the beginning. So I remember like sort of raising my voice about, is it the right look here for this thing? And we kind of made the teaser, and then when it was done, I was like, I'm not really sure about the eyes. They are a bit cartoony, and they were like, come on, it's done now. And I realized that with animation, if you see something you don't like, you gotta say it straight away, because once you have animated, it's just too late. So that was really nice. We had these kind of tests that we could do and develop the character design, so it fitted that mature adult sort of realistic and authenticity that we were going for. And I think authenticity was like a key for us, that we wanted people to be able to relate to Amin and relate to his story and feel what he was feeling.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's what's wonderful about animation is for some reason it brings out this universality, that you can really connect with. And I had no problem with anyone's eyes in the film, for what it's worth. Like I was there with.
No, but that was it.
Can you and you had like a few different styles too, right? That thematically kind of. Can you talk about that and maybe a little bit? It's just about the decision to put some of those like archival moments in, just that really beautifully contextualize like kind of the space as you're transitioning in the stories.
I think the archive was thought of from the very beginning, because it was very important for Jonas that even though we are telling through animation, that it was clear that this is a real story and a true story. And so we're kind of using the archive as a reminder of like of the time and place that Amin were. So Jonas did go to he went to Moscow, he went to Estonia, he went to some of the places that Amin been to experience them himself. And for us it was very important to show Kabul back in the 80s, because it's different what Kabul was like 5 years ago and very different what was today. And what was very interesting was that this was during the communism that he lived there, and he lived when the Mujahideen took over and the Russians then left. So that was very important for us to capture this sort of historical moment. And then we researched and we found the right places for in the film. They tried to escape through Estonia, and we actually managed to find the right. We knew that there was a Finnish crew that was filming. Amin told us this, that was filming at this refugee center. That was almost, it was like a prison. So the archive you see there is actually from the time that Amin was there. And the same in Sweden, when the ferry with his sisters are coming in, that was actually the real ferry and the real situation of the sisters. So it was very important for us that was very clear. And then otherwise we had a 2D animated, which is defined, so very detailed animation that's very, very expensive. So we kind of knew that we also had to be a little bit creative about how to prioritize the support we had, the money we had. And sometimes the limits are very good, because then you think up creative solutions. And one of them was to have this layer that's more like that's used, it's a graphical layer and it's much more abstract, and it's when he's trying to think back and trying to remember things, and that you go into a very emotional sort of traumatic room. So somehow the three layers kind of work together, or layers the different kinds of animation.
It's beautiful. Thanks for sharing. I'm going to pop over to Joseph with Summer of Soul. I've never seen 1969 look any better other than Apollo 11. And it's a really nice, beautiful case for why things should not be shot on video. Can you talk about sort of how you came on board the film and how you came to Amir and just the process of putting it together?
Yeah, excuse me. My story with Amir actually starts 25 years ago. I was a music journalist, young music journalist, and my first cover story was for Rap Pages magazine, On the Roots, and it was the Roots' first cover story as a band. And I was living in the Bay Area at the time and flew out to Philadelphia to interview him, and we just clicked and connected. And after the story, remained friends. Amir is a music junkie. He's a music fan. He knew my byline. He knew pieces I'd written. We spent hours and hours and hours just like debating hip hop. And I say all this out loud, and it's funny because it's such a contrast to some of the other stories that we're hearing today with these great documentaries. But I think, when I was first approached about this project, it was like, oh, did you hear about this music festival that happened in Harlem in 1969, and 300,000 people and all these artists, sort of at the peak of their careers or soon to be peaks. And I had never heard of it, and I'm a pretty deep music junkie, and Amir had never heard of it. And I think that set us on this path about, Black stories in America, Black history as a part of American history. And so it was pretty apparent early on. You know, we get told about the festival, someone shot it. We think it's one person with a camera. It turns out to be 4 cameras. And it just sent us down this path talking about what stories are remembered in the canon of history. And, you know, for Amir, I think it was really important for him. You know, he mentioned to me, I actually said no when I was approached by the project at first, because I didn't, you know, Amir has a lot of responsibilities and a lot of things that he does. I wanted to know why he wanted to make this film, if I was going to jump on board and invest my time into it. And what he explained to me is, you know, what are the stories that we remember, and had this been celebrated like it should have been, what kind of an impact and influence would that have made on an entire generation of Black kids growing up in cities all around the country like him. And you know, that really resonated with me, and I realized he wanted to do the film for the right reasons. I loved the challenge of being able to do more than just a music film. When we looked at the festival and in the year it takes place, just our first exercise was what else is happening in the country at the time, what else is happening in Harlem at the time. And you see just how culturally robust things are happening. And you take the moon landing, for example. The moon landing happens on one of the days of the festival. And, you know, the moon landing is something that, you know, we are taught that everyone revered, but really Black Americans didn't see it that way. A lot of people living in inner cities didn't see it that way. And that just got our brains and our hearts excited about the kind of story we could tell. And, you know, you ask about challenges, and I think there's a lot of challenges to making this film in particular. I'm really happy that people don't just see it as an archival film. I think one of the biggest challenges we had was memory. Finding people that went to the festival. 2 great producers on our film, Cora Atkinson and Ashley Bembry Kaintuck, helped us locate people who went to the festival. What you realize is that 50 years ago is a very long time, and finding people who remember details of the festival was difficult, especially in Harlem. It's not just something you can put out on social media. Those people who went to the festival are probably at an age group where they're not really active on social media. So we hit Harlem, put boots on the ground, and made a flyer about what we were doing, and went to social clubs and churches and Black Panther meetings and record stores, and what we found were a lot of people who not only went to the festival but also just had this deep memory for it, visceral memory, and it meant something to them. And some of them had been talking about this festival for decades, and no one really believed them. It just, you know, every layer we unpeeled just was so satisfying to find out that it just was adding to this deeper story to tell, using the festival as a conduit. And then some of the practical challenges were, you know, the concert was shot on 2-inch videotape, and it wasn't organized footage, and finding a way to transfer that with people who cared about the art and craft of digitizing old footage like that was it took about 6 weeks, 8 weeks to locate the right people. And then it was a long process to get it digitized and get some of the mold and baked off and some of the glue removed. I think also about halfway through filming, COVID hit. And, you know, one of the things that allowed us to do was spend some time in the edit, and then figuring out how to edit remotely. Evercast really saved our film. It gave us some time while some of us adjusted to figuring out how we're going to get the rest of the interviews. It gave us a lot of time in the edit to just play around with structure and to figure out, you know, how to structure this story, how to tell the story, how to interweave the story between what's happening on stage and what's happening off stage. In a weird way, it gave us a forced moment of pause to really just assess what we had, the story we wanted to tell, and just a little room to breathe to sort of like spend some time on the nuance of the storytelling.
I can't imagine getting to spend COVID with that footage and, you know, immersing yourself in that world. That's wonderful. Thanks for sharing. Megan, let's talk about Simple as Water. Can you tell us how the film came about and how long and some of the challenges you had and how you approached finding your wonderful characters?
Sure, happily. So I came to this story really as a human being, not as a filmmaker. I mean, not totally dissimilarly what we're going on now. All of us, I imagine, are waking up and reading headlines and being overwhelmed with sort of this feeling of how can this be happening with what's going on in Ukraine. And so back in 2015, I was doing that, waking up each morning, really consumed with news of the exodus out of Syria, and particularly in the Mediterranean, sort of trying to reconcile as a human being how it was that we were letting families who were managing to get out of a war zone, you know, as families now getting out of Ukraine are, but then they were being confronted with closing borders and having to, you know, negotiate with smugglers and climb barbed wire and all of that. And what was going on personally for me is I was the mother of a 3-year-old at the time. So this sort of shift had happened in the way I was seeing the world. You know, both its beauty and all of its injustice was from the point of view as a parent, and trying to reconcile and grapple with, like, how would you just say that very basic thing, like, trust me, everything's going to be okay, when you absolutely couldn't. So that really pulled me in. And I mean, like all of us on this call, I'm sure everyone is aware, but after a while, if something has hold of your head and heart, day after day after day, week after week, you have to sort of think about making a film. And I was somewhat slow to think I had something to contribute. I've never experienced, you know, war and displacement, spent time in Syria, but I felt like what had pulled me in could be that point of view as a parent, could be a valid point of entry for looking at what war does to families. And then sort of my next pivot was, how do I find a way to represent this massive scale? I mean, half of the country had been forced to flee, and there's such, I had made a film decades earlier called Lost Boys of Sudan. Now I'm feeling very old, not quite 2 decades earlier, but a while ago. And so I knew from that experience how multi-layered it is. So I was trying to figure out a way to do what feels very organic to me, which is very intimate, character-driven verite, but still represent the scale of that displacement. And so I landed on this sort of, the film is told as 5 separate vignettes, each one focusing on a different family in a different country at a different moment in time. But wanting it to have this very slice of life feel, we sort of descend very deeply and intimately with the families, but I wanted it to sort of signal that there's a continuum. There was a lot of life before we caught up with them, and then there's going to be a lot of life after the film leaves them, but find a way for them to sort of hand off to each other and create a whole. So sort of once that aha happened, then it was really about sort of team building and informing, and there's a huge constellation of people that came together to make this film. We had about 20 different Syrians who worked in the film, 2 co-producers who worked across storylines, an all-Syrian team that filmed our Syrian chapter, Robin Hessman here in the States who produced with me. And each story, because I like to work with a very small footprint, each story sort of had its own family. There we had 3 different cinematographers, one who worked on 3 stories, and then 2 who worked on 1 story each. But there was also this continuum sort of in our relationship with the families. So there was, we looked for families in 7 different countries. And it was field producing teams, often of 2 people, somebody, always a Syrian freelance journalists or people with human rights or social work experience who would go out and meet families. And so we were looking for all of these layers of that experience, but then also all of the things of location and that sort of magic of character and all of that. So it was really, you know, the core of that relationship building that the Syrians on the team were able to do, that the days that we actually filmed are sort of a continuum of that relationship. So it was lots and lots of time before the actual shooting. I'm not sure if that answered this.
No, it does. And I mean, can you talk about, I think one of my favorite parts in the film is you get to the end and you have the payoff of the beginning. And it just really brings the whole, you know, it just brings it all very full circle. And it's, you know, there's still a lot of story left, but it's it's hopeful to see that family reunited. Can you talk a little bit about how that sort of came about?
Sure. Yeah, so we didn't know that we were going to be able to bookend because very much Yasmin, who's the mother in Greece that we filmed with, and her family was the first story that I shot. And then the final story is the last one we shot. And there's about 2.5 years in between there. This was all grants funded, so a lot of that time was not shooting. But we didn't know they were going to be reunited, just like they didn't know. And so I had known that I wanted to do a chapter on fathers. I thought that perspective, one of the things that happened with the Syrian crisis is often fathers would go ahead and make sure the route was safe with the expectation that they'd be able to bring their families, and then of course get caught in bureaucratic limbo. And so we were researching doing a chapter on fathers either in Germany or Sweden, but always keeping in touch with Safwan, who's the father of our opening chapter. And one of the nice advantages of even though I shot, it was very much, we shot with most of the stories just once. We had our field producers in each country who were either stuck or chosen to live there. A lot of them were refugees themselves, who could keep those relationships going. So we were in constant touch with Safwan and Yasmin, and started getting news that it looked like their name had gotten onto a list. And so then we knew that usually means within about 3 months they would be resettled. And so we had been staying in touch with Safwan, and then I went and sort of met with him and his roommates and made sure that they were game for participating. And so, yes, I mean, we were, in documentary, you don't want that like overly neat and tidy happy ending, because that would be misrepresentative of this experience, but it felt like a really, a little bit of hope that you needed a touch of that. And then we didn't know, in the end that the family would come and then be separated again, that the mom and the kids wouldn't be allowed to stay with him. And so that, again, I mean, it unfolded for us as it unfolded for them, but it felt valid to that experience that yes, there's some resolution, but there's this lasting damage and separation that will resonate. So it was, I think it's always that balancing, at least for me in the edit. I mean, part of it was circumstantial for us. We were hopeful that would happen and we could bookend the film that way. Wanting to not clue you in from the get-go that that's where you were landing. And so that was fun in the edit to sort of work on like showing cuts to people and figuring out when they realized that it was the same family, different people managed it differently.
I mean, when you realize it's an extraordinary moment, it's, and it's wonderful. And I think both your film and Flea are just, just so timely and important for everybody to see. I mean, I think I read that, couple million people have been displaced in the Ukraine in like literally less than 2 weeks time. So thank you for your work and for the film, because I think it's going to be important for many people to see. Last but not least, Sushmit, would you like to tell us about Writing with Fire and how you came to the project and found these extraordinary women?
Absolutely accidentally, Diane. So we saw a photo story online and it drew us in because it was essentially images of women distributed in newspapers in a very arid landscape in central India. Reached out to them and they invited us for a meeting. And that's what they said, come for this meeting. So we journeyed across 600 kilometers. There were no airports nearby. So it was an overnight train journey. And on a lark, we just decided to take our cameras along because we were making sort of like this trip down. And the first day that we were with them is one of the early scenes in the film where Mira is making a pitch from 14 years of print news making to digital. And the conversations in that room around journalism were so sophisticated and nuanced. It could be actually a newsroom at the New York Times. And this is around 2016, where they were talking about the importance of this shift and why they need to do this. And that first day itself, we were like, we're onto a story and this is going to be a feature-length piece because there is no way you can contain this in 15, 20 minutes. And Rintu and I had, till then, for about 8 years, our body of work is essentially short nonfiction. And we'd been looking out for a film that would sort of enable us to dive into a longer format. And when we came across these journalists, we knew this was the story.
And what were some of the challenges in terms of capturing their story and filming and just trying to get the project off the ground?
I mean, I have a list. I don't know where to start. Just from a context point of view, the irony is India is one of the largest film producing countries in the world, but there are no systems of support for nonfiction. There's not a single fund available for documentary filmmakers over here. So it essentially had to be about sort of raising funds internationally. But I think we spent the first year self-financing ourselves. We run a film production company. So a lot of the projects that we did, the money was sort of channeled in to invest in Writing with Fire. Logistically, what we had to do was keep the film crew really small on ground. There was just the three of us, essentially because we were working in spaces that were either risky or hostile or spaces of deep trauma. Also because you're working with journalists and you know which way you want to sort of interfere in their workflow and sort of build a choreography of trust with them. Our creative approach essentially was, how do you give the audience an experience of what it means being a Dalit woman journalist working in the badlands of the country? And how do you show more and tell less? So we knew that we wanted to push this more into the space of observational. What essentially happened was that we ended up, those dreams you have of filming with bigger cameras and the most sophisticated equipment went down the drain because we were traveling an average of 100 to 120 kilometers every day to and fro with the journalists in the field. Extremely dusty regions, very hot temperatures, 42 degrees Celsius was, so we had to work with systems that were robust and could stand that kind of temperature. We had no lights, no artificial lighting. We shot the whole film handheld. I think on the ground, we sort of developed like a choreography between the three of us, Rintu and me and Karan, who was our co-cinematographer. And the fact that we'd worked for almost a decade together before that sort of allowed us to instinctively trust each other's approaches, because you can't talk on the set, so to speak. And it was always about, being able to sort of frame yourself in a way. It was a bit meta because you had journalists who were filming their truth, but as documentary filmmakers, the moment you point your camera at someone, truth really becomes an abstraction. And so these were sort of like the conversations that were playing out in our head as well. And I think the third fundamental challenge was, we knew that for this one, we wanted to sort of maintain the producing integrity of the film as an Indian project, because this was a film about marginalized Dalit women. And this was the first time that the world was actually going to experience the power of a Dalit woman, because till then the representation of Dalit women, even in pop culture in India, had been one of victimhood. And we sort of wanted to invert that storytelling. And I remember there was one pitching forum very early on where one commissioning editor got very excited after the pitch and said, yeah, this is going to be the next India's Daughter. And like, on the contrary, this is quite an antithesis to that film. It's looking at it in a very different lens and a very different light. So I think that, being able to sort of like build the budget and to find the right kind of allies within the industry, funding systems and support networks who understood what our vision was and what we were trying to do with this film. It took its time, but eventually, yeah, there was a village that sort of like, was sort of built around this film.
So did it take like 4 or 5 years? Is that what you were from?
Yeah, so we chanced upon the story late in 2015 and started filming in 2016. And we filmed for about 4 years, and the editing took about 1.5 years. So roughly about 5 years or as my mother says, you didn't give this film 5 years, you gave it half a decade. And that sounds heavier, So I was like, yeah, that's the amount of time we put into this. but it's been also a massive learning experience for us, because to be able to do this and bring a film out into the world is its own unique birthing process, and the complexity of like distribution networks and territories. And I think as filmmakers who retain producing rights, we really had to learn from scratch. I mean, I think I can admit to saying this: when we started filming, we had no idea what the difference between an executive producer, an associate producer, and a co-producer was. But it's through the process of actually sort of doing or having this journey, and essentially finding so many folks in the industry who really championed us, that we were able to sort of like find a frame of reference, and now have been able to come to a place where, you're able to sort of like look at this journey with a certain distance, but that there are more filmmakers in the pipeline coming in from the global south who won't have to sort of do this again, and that there are some doors that are open and it's easier, So I think that's sort of like something that we also feel very happy about, having done Writing with Fire the way we did it.
I mean, that's such a honestly perfect way to sort of wrap this amazing conversation up with so many of you. And thank you so much for all of your time and your stories and your experience. I mean, I think what we can take away from this is that producers are integral, important, and crucial to the creation of these films, alongside their directors and other collaborators. And I'm just honored to spend the time with you, and congratulations to everybody. Everybody is a winner, and these films are gonna just, inspire people for years to come. So thank you.
Thanks, Diane. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks,
Okay.
everyone.
Bye.
Bye.
Right.